You live in a small brick house on Larkspur Avenue, the kind of house people drive past without noticing. And for the last 10 years, every single Thursday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, you've walked into Dunbrook's Grocery on the corner of 5th and Main and quietly paid off a stranger's tab. You never announce it. You never ask for a name. You simply hand the cashier your card, tell her to apply it to whoever's next in line who's short on cash, and you leave before anyone can turn around and thank you. Your name is Halbert Kesling. You're 79 years old, and this Thursday, like every Thursday for a decade, you're standing in the same spot by the magazine rack, watching quietly to make sure your ritual goes exactly as planned. Without a single person in this town knowing your name, you weren't always a man people would call generous. That's the part nobody knows. Not even the cashiers who've watched you shuffle in every week for 10 straight years. You spent 31 years running a small hardware store 2 blocks from here. And you spent most of those years being exactly the kind of man who counted every penny twice, who turned away customers a nickel short, who believed, with the hard certainty of someone who'd clawed his way up from nothing, that the world didn't owe anybody a free ride. That changed the year your wife Cordelia got sick. That changed the year you watched a stranger, a woman you never even got the name of, quietly pay off 3 months of your wife's prescription bill at the pharmacy counter without a word, without waiting to be thanked, without ever telling you who she was. You spent the rest of your life trying to become that stranger for someone else. If you're the kind of person who believes a single quiet act of kindness can ripple further than anyone ever expects, stay with me, because what happens after Halbert's story ends is going to remind you why this channel exists in the first place. Go ahead and hit subscribe before we keep going, because there are more stories like his waiting for you. Cordelia passed 11 years ago, just 1 year before you started your Thursday ritual, and in some strange way, paying for strangers, groceries became the only thing that made the silence in your house bearable. You never remarried. You never had children of your own. A fact that used to ache more than you let anyone see. Especially in the years after Cordelia, when Sunday dinners shrank down to a single plate and a single chair. But you had Dunbrooks, you had Thursdays, you had the quiet, invisible satisfaction of watching a young mother's shoulders relax when the cashier told her the balance was already covered, watching a construction worker's face crumple with confused gratitude when he realized someone he'd never met had just made his week easier. You never wanted credit. You wanted more than anything to be the reason someone's terrible week became just a little less terrible, the way that stranger had once done for you and Cordelia without ever asking for anything in return. The town started noticing eventually. In the vague way small towns notice things. A whisper here, a rumor there, someone mentioning the man who pays for groceries, without ever attaching a face to the phrase. You liked it that way. You liked being a ghost who did good things and disappeared before anyone could pin a name to the kindness. The cashiers who'd worked there long enough learned not to point you out, learned to simply nod when you walked in on Thursday mornings, learned to keep your secret the way you'd asked them to all those years ago, when you first slid your card across the counter and said, quietly, just don't tell them it was me. Your health started slipping about 8 months ago, though you were careful not to let anyone see it happening. A cough that wouldn't quit, weight falling off a frame that was never particularly large to begin with. You knew, in the private way that old men sometimes just know things about their own bodies, that something serious was wrong long before the doctors confirmed it. Stage 4, they said, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't leave room for negotiation, the kind that gives you months instead of years. You didn't tell anyone, not your neighbor Fenimore Roosevelt Judd, who mowed your lawn without being asked most Saturdays, not the mail carrier who'd started leaving your packages on the porch, swing instead of the steps, because she knew your knees had gotten bad. You told no one, because telling people meant they'd start treating you differently, and the one thing you wanted more than anything in your final months was to keep walking into Dunbrooks on Thursday mornings like everything was exactly the same as it had always been. You kept your ritual, going right up until the week. Your body simply wouldn't let you anymore. The last Thursday you managed to make it into the store. You had to stop twice on the short walk from the parking lot just to catch your breath, gripping the cart rail so hard your knuckles went white. And the cashier and a young woman named Thessaly, who'd worked the register for almost 5 years and had never once broken your confidence, gave you a look of quiet, worried concern that you waved off with a tired smile. You handed her your card that morning the same way you always did. You told her, same as always, to apply it to whoever needed it next. You didn't tell her it would be the last time. You died 3 weeks later, quietly in your own bed, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of an old wall clock keeping you company. There was no dramatic final scene, no gathered family at your bedside, because you had no family left to gather. Fenimore found you the next afternoon, when you didn't answer his knock about the leaves needing raking, and he was the one who called it in. The one who stood in your quiet kitchen with tears in his eyes for a neighbor he'd only really known through small kindnesses over a shared fence line. Your funeral was scheduled for a modest Saturday morning at Willowmere Cemetery, and the funeral home director, a soft-spoken man named Osric Pemberton, who'd handled your paperwork with the same quiet efficiency you'd always appreciated in strangers, expected almost no one to show up. You'd left instructions, simple ones, tucked into a folder in your desk drawer. No obituary in the paper. No elaborate service, just a plain headstone next to Cordelia's, and whatever was left in your accounts to be split evenly among 3 local charities you'd quietly supported for years. You expected, if you'd let yourself think about it at all, that maybe Fenimore would show up, maybe Thessaly if she had the morning free, and that would be the entirety of your send-off. A quiet ghost buried the same way he'd lived. That is not what happened. The morning of your funeral, Osric arrived at Willowmere expecting to set up a small canopy and a handful of folding chairs. Instead, he found cars already lining the cemetery road before 8 in the morning, more arriving by the minute, people spilling out of vehicles in their Sunday best, clutching flowers, clutching tissues, clutching photographs of grocery receipts they'd kept for years without knowing why they'd bothered to save them. By 9 o'clock, when the service was set to begin, there were over 200 people, standing shoulder to shoulder across the cemetery lawn, far more than Osric had ever seen for a man with no listed family, no announced obituary, no fanfare of any kind. Thessaly was there, of course, standing near the front with red-rimmed eyes, and it was Thessaly, eventually, who explained to a stunned Osric exactly why so many strangers had come. She'd spent the 3 days since your death quietly reaching out to people, one by one, using an old ledger she'd secretly kept behind the register for years. Not out of nosiness, she explained later, but because she'd wanted someday to be able to thank you properly, even if you never wanted her to. In that ledger were names, dozens and dozens of names, spanning a full decade, every single person whose grocery bill you'd quietly paid off on a Thursday morning without ever asking for thanks. There was Marisol Fenwick, a young widow who'd been standing at the register in tears 8 years ago. Her card declined in front of a line of impatient strangers, the exact moment you'd stepped forward and quietly told the cashier to put it on your account instead. There was Bartholomew Ashgrove, a laid-off factory worker who'd been buying the cheapest possible food for his 3 kids the week you covered his bill, a kindness that let him keep the lights on 1 more month until he found new work. There was an elderly woman named Prudence Calloway, a widow herself, who'd been quietly weeping over the cost of her husband's prescription-adjacent groceries, the same way Cordelia once had, and who told the gathered crowd, voice trembling, that a stranger's kindness that day had taught her that grief doesn't have to make the world feel entirely cold. One by one, they stood at the small podium set up near your grave, strangers who had never known your face, who had only ever known the invisible weight of your kindness lifting off their shoulders on some ordinary, terrible Thursday. A teenage boy named Roscoe Whitlock, barely 18, stood up and explained, through tears, that the groceries you'd paid for during his mother's worst month had been the difference between his little sister eating dinner or going to bed hungry, and that he'd spent years since then trying to figure out how to say thank you to a man he'd never even seen. A young mother, Marigold Estrada, explained that the kindness had come during the exact week she'd almost given up entirely, and that not knowing who to thank had haunted her for years, had made her promise herself that if she ever found out, she'd tell him what it meant. Now, she said, voice breaking, she finally could, even if it was 3 days too late for you to hear it. Fenimore spoke last, standing beside your modest headstone with his hat in his hands, and he told the crowd something none of them had known. That you'd never had children, never remarried after Cordelia, had spent your final months quietly dying without telling a single soul. All so you could keep walking into that grocery store on Thursday mornings for just a little while longer, doing the one thing that had made your life feel like it mattered. He told them about the stranger who'd once paid Cordelia's pharmacy bill, about how you'd spent the rest of your life trying to become that same invisible kindness for someone else. Over and over, week after week, for 10 straight years, never once needing credit, never once needing to be seen. By the time the service ended, there wasn't a dry eye left on that cemetery lawn. 200 strangers, most of whom had never met each other, stood together in a loose, grieving circle around a man they'd only ever known through a quietly covered grocery bill, and something in that gathering felt less like a funeral and more like a reckoning. Proof, undeniable and overwhelming, that the smallest acts of kindness never actually disappear the way we assume they do. They just wait, quietly, for the moment they're finally allowed to be seen. In the weeks that followed, Thessaly did something she hadn't planned on doing when she first started reaching out to names in that old ledger. She started a small fund at Dunbrooks, named simply Halbert's Thursdays, where customers could anonymously contribute toward covering strangers' grocery bills, the same way you had, quietly, without fanfare, every single week. Within the first month, the fund had more contributors than she ever expected. People who'd never even met you, people who'd only heard the story secondhand, people who simply wanted to be part of keeping something alive that felt, in a town that could sometimes feel forgotten by the rest of the world, genuinely good. Marisol Fenwick became one of the fund's most consistent contributors, dropping in whatever she could spare every payday, telling Thessaly once, quietly, that she finally understood why you'd never wanted thanks, that the giving itself had probably been enough, that maybe that was the whole secret you'd spent your life trying to teach without ever saying a single word about it. Bartholomew Ashgrove brought his kids by the store some Thursdays now, teaching them in his own quiet way to notice when someone in line ahead of them looked like they were having a hard week, teaching them that kindness doesn't need permission or applause to matter. Your headstone at Willowmere Cemetery is simple, exactly the way you asked for it to be, resting quietly beside Cordelia's under the shade of an old oak tree. But most Thursday mornings now, someone leaves something small there. A grocery receipt, a flower, a folded note nobody reads aloud. Fenimore still mows the grass around it without being asked. And every single Thursday at Dunbrooks, somewhere in that store, someone's bill gets quietly covered by a stranger who will never ask for their name to be known, because that, in the end, was the only inheritance you ever truly wanted to leave behind. Not money, not a name on a building, just the quiet, ongoing proof that one person's kindness, given without any need to be seen, can still be enough to change an entire town long after they're gone. The truest kindness is the kind no one ever thanks you for, because it was never given to be seen, only to be felt.